Nuclear war, just two words, yet they've cast a shadow over our world for decades. And now, in the year 2025, they feel closer and more real than ever. The threat today is more tangible than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But unlike that historical flashpoint in the Caribbean, this time the tension lies in the heart of Europe. As the war in Ukraine drags on, the rhetoric from both Russia and the West grows increasingly dangerous. Once unthinkable, nuclear strikes are now being discussed openly. Doctrines are shifting, nerves are fraying, and some experts are warning that the first act of war might not be a formal declaration, but the blinding light of a mushroom cloud. This isn't science fiction, nor is it fear-mongering. It's a grim and escalating reality that Europe must now confront. But what would actually unfold if a nuclear conflict were to erupt? The answer is far more horrifying than most people comprehend. A single tactical strike could ignite a chain reaction of global devastation. We'll explore how this might happen, how well prepared or unprepared Europe is, and what the aftermath might look like in the hours, days, and even years after the initial blast. When most people imagine nuclear war, they picture entire cities wiped off the map, radiation sickness spreading across continents, and billions of lives lost under the shroud of nuclear winter. And while that might sound extreme, if a full-scale nuclear exchange were to occur between NATO, especially the US, and Russia, possibly involving China, those catastrophic outcomes would become a terrifying reality. But nuclear weapons have evolved significantly since the US bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Modern nuclear conflict doesn't automatically mean global annihilation. With the advent of tactical nuclear weapons, mutual destruction is no longer a guaranteed outcome. The concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, still holds when strategic nukes are used, but tactical nukes change the rules of engagement. To illustrate, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima weighed nearly 10,000 pounds and killed over 100,000 people by year's end. Today's nukes are much smaller and lighter, sometimes just a few hundred pounds, yet many are even more deadly. The core threat facing Europe in any nuclear confrontation is, of course, Russia. Some of Russia's nuclear warheads are more than 50 times more powerful than the bombs dropped in 1945. Russia possesses a full nuclear triad, the ability to launch nuclear weapons from land-based silos and mobile systems, from the air via long-range bombers like the Tu-22M, and from its fleet of nuclear submarines. Russia also holds more nuclear warheads than all NATO nuclear powers combined. By 2022 estimates, Russia had around 5,500 warheads, with 1,500 retired, 1,588 deployed, and nearly 2,900 in reserve. The US, by comparison, had around 5,044 total, 1,336 retired, 1,770 deployed, and 1,938 in reserve. The UK had roughly 225 active warheads, 60 deployed, and 120 in reserve, while France had about 290, with 10 in reserve and the rest deployed. Without direct US involvement, Europe would be outnumbered almost 10 to 1 in nuclear firepower. True, the combined 470 warheads of the UK and France could still inflict severe damage on Russia, but if Russia used even half its arsenal against Europe while reserving the other half for a potential US response, the damage to Europe could be devastating, made worse by its dense population centers and relatively small geographic size. That's assuming all these weapons even work. Many date back to the Cold War. Despite updates over the decades, nuclear weapons, missiles, and their delivery systems degrade with time. Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed in late 2023 that 95% of Russia's nuclear forces had been modernized, with naval forces nearing 100%. But as the Ukraine war has shown, modernization doesn't always translate to reliability. Russia has had issues with everything from tanks to artillery. Even the US isn't immune. A test of a Minuteman III ICBM failed in November 2023. Moreover, many nukes on both sides could be intercepted by missile defense systems, but these systems are not foolproof. In fact, they're largely optimized to defend against limited threats like North Korea or Iran, not a mass barrage from Russia or China. While the US missile defense system includes layers like the Aegis BMD, ground-based mid-course defense, and terminal high-altitude area defense, it remains vulnerable to being overwhelmed by a full-scale attack. If Russia launched a limited strike using tactical nuclear weapons, there's a chance NATO defenses could neutralize some of them. But against a large-scale attack, Europe would be dangerously exposed. Even now, NATO has only about 5% of the air defense capacity needed to protect Eastern Europe from a full conventional assault, let alone a nuclear one. Tactical nuclear weapons, smaller, lower-yield devices meant for battlefield use, are a major wildcard. Russia is believed to have around 1,900 of these, and it's likely that a European nuclear war would start with one or more being launched.
According to Russia's revised doctrine, if a non-nuclear country like Ukraine, backed by nuclear-armed allies like France or the UK, targets Russia's nuclear deterrence with conventional weapons, Moscow could retaliate with a nuclear strike. That retaliation wouldn't necessarily be limited to Ukraine. The supporting NATO countries could also be seen as valid targets. In May 2025, Ukraine attacked Russian strategic bombers deep within Russian territory, likely with help from Western intelligence. That means countries like the UK or France might also be on Russia's target list.
Still, Russia is unlikely to fire a massive nuclear barrage at NATO countries unless its regime feels existentially threatened by defeat in Ukraine. More likely, it would use tactical nukes to strike a significant Ukrainian target, like bridges over the Dnieper River, or potentially a NATO base in Poland or Romania. Such a move would serve both as retaliation and a test of NATO's resolve under Article 5, which obliges members to defend each other militarily if attacked. But that article doesn't clearly define what form that response must take. France and the UK, for example, have no formal obligation to use their nuclear arsenals to defend other NATO members. France's tactical capabilities are unclear, and the UK possesses no tactical nukes at all. That leaves Europe heavily reliant on the US to respond in kind to any Russian tactical strike. Otherwise, the only option might be to escalate with strategic weapons, a far more dangerous path. There's broad disagreement among experts about how a nuclear conflict would unfold, but most agree. Once a nuke is used, everything becomes unpredictable. A single tactical nuke, say on a Ukrainian airbase, could quickly spiral into a global nuclear catastrophe. The initial destruction from such a weapon would be devastating. If a nuclear plant were hit, the outcome could mimic a strategic level strike, unleashing chaos over vast areas. Even a hit on a major power grid or communications hub would cause nationwide havoc. But in most scenarios, the damage would be localized, a city block or a few square miles, depending on where the bomb detonated. Radiation would affect the immediate vicinity, but nuclear winter would not follow from a single strike. Ground zero would be devastated, but other areas, even parts of the same city, might remain intact. In April 2025, the European Commission advised all 450 million EU residents to prepare a 72-hour survival kit as part of its new civil preparedness strategy. These kits should include basic tools, food, medicine, water, and communication devices to help survive the critical early days after a disaster. Unless you're at the blast site itself, such preparation could be life-saving. Just a few dozen miles of distance from a detonation can make the difference between death and survival. But if a strategic nuclear exchange begins, the outlook is grim for Europe, and possibly the entire planet. Some Cold War-era bunkers still exist in cities like Bonn, Prague, and Kiev, but they can only shelter a small fraction of the population. Most people wouldn't make it in time anyway. Central European cities would have perhaps 10 minutes to seek cover after detecting inbound missiles. London or Dublin might get 20. The chaos would be unimaginable. Radiation would affect the immediate vicinity, but nuclear winter would not follow from a single strike. Ground zero would be devastated, but other areas, even parts of the same city, might remain intact. In April 2025, the European Commission advised all 450 million EU residents to prepare a 72-hour survival kit as part of its new civil preparedness strategy. These kits should include basic tools, food, medicine, water, and communication devices to help survive the critical early days after a disaster. Unless you're at the blast site itself, such preparation could be life-saving. Just a few dozen miles of distance from a detonation can make the difference between death and survival. But if a strategic nuclear exchange begins, the outlook is grim for Europe and possibly the entire planet. Some Cold War-era bunkers still exist in cities like Bonn, Prague, and Kiev, but they can only shelter a small fraction of the population. Most people wouldn't make it in time anyway. Central European cities would have perhaps 10 minutes to seek cover after detecting inbound missiles. London or Dublin might get 20. The chaos would be unimaginable.
In contrast, Russia's civil defense plans are more advanced. In 2024, they began mass-producing KUBM mobile shelters capable of withstanding radiation and chemical exposure for 48 hours. While transportable and rugged, it's doubtful that Russia can produce enough to shelter entire cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg. Even one Topol-M missile would produce a fireball nearly a mile wide, incinerating everything in its path. Within 4 miles, people would be vaporized or crushed by shockwaves. Most buildings would collapse. Fires would rage. Radiation would contaminate water and air for decades. Cities like London, Berlin, Kiev, and Warsaw would need dozens of warheads to be completely destroyed, but smaller capitals like Brussels or Paris could be wiped out with just a few. Meanwhile, Moscow is so vast that even Britain's entire nuclear stockpile couldn't annihilate it completely. Simulations offer chilling scenarios. One created by Time magazine and nuclear scientists in 2023 suggested that the first strikes would target electronics with EMPs, then military command sites, finally major cities.
A similar Princeton study, Plan A, imagined Russia launching a single nuke from Kaliningrad. NATO responds with one of its own. Russia escalates, firing 300 warheads. NATO counters with 600 more. Cities become targets. By the time it's over, tens of millions are dead, and the world is in ruins. If you're lucky enough to be far from ground zero and equipped with food, medicine, and protective gear, you might survive. But survival in a post-nuclear world is not just about the blast. The real terror is what comes after: global collapse, famine, chaos. Research warns that smoke from firestorms would reach the stratosphere, block sunlight, and trigger a nuclear winter. Global temperatures would plummet, crops would fail. One study in Nature estimated over 5 billion deaths from starvation. 99% of people in industrial nations could die. In the aftermath, law and order would crumble, economies would collapse, and recovery might take centuries, if it ever comes. As Alicia Sanders-Zakra from the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons put it, there is no rational plan once the first nuke is launched. The only sane option is prevention, through diplomacy, treaties, and collective sanity. Let's hope that day never comes. And if you want to stay informed as this story continues to unfold, subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching.